Chapter 1 of The Way to Willpower by Henry Hazleton. Chapter 1. A Revelation. You have seen the advertisements. The lion and the man are facing each other, the man upstanding, hands clenched, his look defiant and terrible, the lion crouching. Who will win? The man, without doubt. He has what the beast lacks, willpower. And at the bottom of the page is the triangular clipping which you cut out and send for the book on how to acquire it. Or perhaps the advertisement promises you a $10,000 a year position. Nothing less than $10,000 a year seems capable of attracting the present-day reader of 20-cent magazines. And those positions, one learns, are reserved for the men of willpower, not forgetting the capitals. The advertisements portray bizarre ideas about the will and willpower. Anyone who has the remotest notion of psychology might be led from them to suspect the advertised course. But the advertisements reflect not alone the advertiser's ideas, but the ideas of the plain man. They are written to catch the plain man's eye, and they do catch his eye. Else how to account for their persistence, their enlargement, and their multiplication, notwithstanding the notorious expensiveness of advertising? Now, I am about to reveal a profound secret about the will. The revelation will cause a good deal of shock and disappointment and a bedlam of protest. However, I derive courage to meet the protest because I have an imposing body of psychologic opinion behind me. I have behind me most of the reputable psychologic opinion since Herbert Spencer. And so, here it is. The will does not exist. I repeat it lest you fancy there has been a mistake. There is no such thing as the will, nor such a thing as willpower. These are merely convenient words. Now, when a man denies the existence of the will, he is on dangerous ground. It is as though he were to deny the existence of the tomato. Yet I do deny that the will exists in anything like the same sense that the tomato exists. The tomato is a definite entity. You can pick it up, handle it, feel it, or throw it at the person who denies its existence. And this evidence of reality may convince him. But I am not so crude nor so fatuous as to deny the existence of the will simply because you cannot feel it or taste it. I do not deny it simply because it is not material and tangible. I deny it because it is not even spiritual. The plain man's conception of the will is utterly and grotesquely wrong, and he must be shaken from it violently. The popular conception seems to be that the Creator, having decided that a man might want to have a brain to use upon occasion, bethought himself about the ingredients, and dropped in first a memory, then an imagination, then a will, and then a power to reason. Though popular conception is vague on the details, it is probable that the last was a small parcel, wrapped in prejudices to protect it from strain. But the Creator could have left out the will, and no one would have been the wiser. Proof of it is that so few of us were. It was only recently that psychologists began to suspect its absence. You are making a gesture of impatience. This is a little too stiff, you say. There is a limit to which you can impose on me. I know when a man shows a will and when he doesn't. I have met strong-willed men, and I have met weak-willed men, and I know the difference when I see it. For your remonstrance I have the greatest respect, and I will now proceed to give heed to it. End of Chapter 1. Chapter 2. The Intellect as a Valet. Having given some hint of what the will is not, it is now my pleasant duty to tell what it is. This may best be done by illustration. You resolve to abolish late nights. 2 nights out a week will be your limit. No night out later than midnight. It doesn't pay. A man loses sleep. He hurts his health. He isn't as fresh as he ought to be for work. He is just frittering his time away and getting nowhere, and not improving himself evenings, and it's expensive, and... So, you resolve to cut it out. With a free conscience, you make your 2 engagements for the coming week. About Monday noon, Jones drops around at the office. There is a little game of poker towards some night that week when they can get the crowd together. Now, poker is marvelously fascinating. You haven't seen the boys for a long time, and you hate to lie to Jones and tell him all your nights are occupied for such a little reason. And you are ashamed to tell him the truth. That you have resolved to go out only 2 nights a week, come what may, might strike Jones as deliciously funny. He might tell the boys, who also have a sense of humor. And there is the possibility that Jones might be offended. So you look straight before you, undecided for a minute or two, or you make feeble excuses, not your real ones, which are easily overridden by Jones, and you end up thinking to yourself that you will not count this week or that you will make up for it the week after. And your dishonor is complete. Let us analyze this degrading incident. Man is a bundle of desires. He desires this and that and something else again. And the world is so constituted that, in nearly every instance, one desire cannot be attained save at the sacrifice of some other. This provoking state of affairs was long ago crystallized in the phrase that you cannot eat your cake and have it too. More broadly, it may be expressed in the phrase that everything we desire has its price. The price of a cake is $1. The price of keeping your dollar is the loss of a cake. This illuminating truth does not stop at the grossly material things, at the things whose prices can be measured in money. It extends throughout the spiritual universe. The price of earning $2 extra a day may be working an extra hour a day, which may be conceived either as the pain of an extra hour's work or as the loss of an hour's leisure. Conversely, the price of an hour's extra leisure a day is $2 a day. We are now coming to grips with our actual case. The price of staying out late at night is sleep, health, efficiency of business, money, self-improvement. That is, these are the things that the man must pay, lose, sacrifice in order that he may stay out late at night. Conversely, the price of sleep, health, efficiency of business, money, self-improvement is the pleasure of staying out late at night that one gives up. We have taken a devious course to arrive at our conclusion, yet we must deviate a little further before we come back. We must consider the intellect. For centuries we have glorified the intellect. We have put wreaths upon its head and sung its praises, which was quite absurd. For a man's intellect is a helpless, powerless sort of thing, a mere instrument, a tool, a subordinate which the desires boss around. It does the bidding of the desire that shouts the loudest. You may call this a libel on the intellect. You perhaps maintain the traditional view that the intellect directs the desires. But reflect. You engage daily in more or less unpleasant tasks for 8 hours. You work. It is your desire for bread and soup and café parfait, for an overcoat, an apartment, and theaters and golf that drives you there. You may protest that you enjoy your work. I shall not gainsay you. In either case, it is your desires that are dictating your action. The intellect merely obeys. If it is a good intellect, its owner may count himself fortunate. It will be better able to carry out the orders of its bosses, the desires. It will satisfy them more, and it will satisfy more of them. The intellect may, and often does, pick the road to a given place. The desires always dictate the designation. To multiply figures, the intellect is the steering wheel. The desires are the engine. The intellect is the pilot. The desires are the breeze. We are now ready to return to our immediate subject. When a man is engaged in what we call making a decision, the intellect may be thought to occupy a place of greater dignity. It may be imagined as acting as a judge between conflicting desires. But the position of the intellect is in reality one of profound humiliation. In deciding between desires, it is actually trying to make up its mind which desire is the stronger. It feels their muscles, so to speak, and it obeys the desire with the hardest biceps. Now, every decision is not merely a selection from among desires. one desire may be so overpowering that all others cringe before it. They are merely brushed out of the way. The function of the intellect, then, in making a decision, is to select from alternative courses the one which most promises to fulfill this supreme desire. I could fancy you rebelling at this point, if in fact you have not done so long ago. What you say may be very true about some people, I can hear you saying. But suppose I refuse to allow my intellect to be bullied around in this shameless manner. Suppose I choose to have my intellect snap its fingers at all my desires and say, hereafter, I will be master. What becomes of all your fine analysis then? This question, my dear sir, is not so formidable as it looks. What it would amount to if you succeeded in carrying out your magnificent defiance, or rather, if you succeeded in thinking you had, would be that your desire, note the word, your desire to have your intellect master would overcome other desires or impulses, recognized by your intellect as such, which arose transiently from moment to moment. You would act only on the desires which your intellect happened to approve of. But that is merely another way of saying that your desire to act on the principles of common sense had overcome all other desires. For mark, there is nothing immoral in desires per se. There are good desires as well as evil. There are spiritual desires as well as material. There are desires to help others, to spread cheerfulness, to protect one's health, to live in moderation, to feel satisfied with one's lot, to succeed in life, to go to heaven, to feel the happiness that virtue gives. And these desires may be just as powerful as selfish desires, or as a craving for transient sensual pleasures. Bernard Shaw says somewhere that real goodness is nothing but the self-indulgence of a good man. Unfortunately, the word desire, taken by itself, has come in popular usage to have a restricted, a sensual, an evil meaning. Popular usage has perverted it just as it has perverted the word pleasure, which arouses such endless confusion of thought and ethical argument. I verily believe that could a man be brought to think of the word desire always in its true and broadest meaning, his aversion to the truth that the desires overlord the intellect would be completely removed. For, as a fact, I have greatly understated the predominance of the desires as compared with the intellect. The very existence of the intellect depends upon the desires. Unless a man have desires, he will have no intellect. Or rather, he will never develop it and never use it, which is much the same thing. Thinking is problem-solving. It arises from thwarted purposes. If we have no desires, we can have no purposes, and hence, nothing to thwart. Thinking may arise as an attempt to solve something bearing on our immediate personal welfare, or on the welfare of our family, or our city, or on the welfare of mankind. It may arise from the love of prestige and applause, or from sheer intellectual curiosity. In any case, desire of some kind is the motivating force. A great difficulty yet remains. You may admit that the intellect is a servant and not a master, but not that it is the servant of your desires. It is the servant of me, you say. It is the servant of my will. These are two distinct, perhaps contradictory, assertions. Let us consider the first. Now, let me ask, what are you? You are nothing but a total. Take away your body. Take away your physical brain. Take away your intellect, your desires, your memory, your imagination. Take away, I say, all the parts and attributes of you, and there is nothing left. That should be obvious, so obvious that I almost blush to state it. Whenever you speak of me, or I, or you are speaking of one part or attribute of yourself, now of another. You may say, I intend to do so-and-so, meaning that a certain desire within you is going to make the rest of you do so-and-so. You say, I am running, meaning that your legs are running, carrying the rest of your body and your brain along with them. You say, I am thinking, meaning that your intellect is thinking. Your knees aren't thinking. Your feet aren't thinking. Your teeth aren't thinking. Only your intellect. In any case, when you refer to I, you are referring now to one part of yourself, now to another. And yet, such is the confusion of thought that because you give the same name now to one part and now to another, you fancy that the word I refers to something distinct from any of these, something in addition, something separable from the parts that compose it. But when you are talking of I in the foregoing sense, you are usually referring to your will, and it is this conception that we must now consider. The brain, as previously intimated, is a receptacle full of conflicting desires. All desires are not ever present, but that is not a point we need consider now. For certain periods, it may be only for a moment, perhaps for a day, possibly for half a lifetime, a certain desire will predominate. That desire, for just as long as it predominates, will determine action. For as long as it predominates and determines action, that desire constitutes your will. It is what you desire to do, what you want to do, what you will to do. But one desire may predominate for 1 hour, and another the next. Just now you may wish to sit home for the evening and improve your mind. That is your will. After reading this a few minutes, you may become bored. I am not blaming you. And may decide to call up your friends and play bridge for the evening. That is also your will. And here we come to the great confusion. These desires, which are constantly gaining individual supremacy and losing it, which are constantly overthrowing and dethroning each other like presidents in a South American republic, are each of them mere temporary holders of power. Yet, we give a permanent name to them. We call one desire the will, and we call the next desire the will. And so we think that the will is something in addition to these separate desires. If we were to say that Warren G. Harding kissed Mrs. Harding, and then were to add that the President of the United States also kissed Mrs. Harding, the confusion between words and things would be obvious. The President of the United States we know to be only another name for Harding. It is merely a permanent name for the different temporary holders of that powerful office, all of different natures. So with the mind. The will is merely a name for the desire that happens to hold temporary power. Take away all desires, and there remains no will. End of Chapter 2. Chapter 3. The Price One Pays. I can fancy that you are becoming somewhat weary. What is the sense of this fellow's always harping on the same thing, you may say? Here he has been going on for 2 chapters with his precious analysis, repeating himself, insisting, emphasizing, underestimating my intelligence. And after I have his point, and he has made himself clear, he keeps on talking. I picked up his book under the impression that it might help me to acquire more willpower, and here he is trying to jam a psychological treatise down my throat. Now, I admit the seeming justice of this, but my point is vital. Before we can acquire willpower, we must first of all know what we are talking about. An amazing amount of cant and nonsense is written about the will. I have seen a book on willpower so thick and formidable that the chairs creaked when you put it upon them, and it was vitiated and full of absurdities from the first page to the last, simply because the author had not the remotest conception of what the will is. Occasionally, there was a little sense, because occasionally the writer caught glimpses of the truth, as a man must in so many pages. But we cannot afford to catch only glimpses. We must know what we are talking about all the time, not merely in moments of absent-mindedness. My point, I repeat, is vital. I am taking no risks with it. Having approached a true conception of the will, we are prepared to go a step farther and to find what we mean by the phrase willpower. And this is not difficult. It resolves itself into a question of time. When we say a man has willpower, we mean that he has a certain desire which persists and predominates for a comparatively long period. It is not being constantly dethroned by a multitude of other desires. Either the other desires are not strong enough, or it is too strong for them, which, as we shall see later, is more than a mere verbal distinction. And if perchance this desire is forced to abdicate for a little while, which may sometimes happen with the strongest-willed persons, it quickly throws out the usurping desire and reigns again. This dominant desire is usually a wish for something remote. The man who obeys it is setting the expected advantage of the future against the supposed advantages of the present. He will not eat an extra slice of that delicious pie, for he knows that if he did, he would 2 hours later be suffering the agonies of indigestion. He will not gaze at that pretty girl in the subway seat opposite, for he has embarked upon the noble enterprise of improving his mind. He has set aside his trip to work in the mornings for concentration on some serious subject. He will not be distracted. Or he will stay late at the office. He will take his work home with him. He will whip his brain on when it is tired. He will shorten his holidays, eliminate social enjoyments, and endanger his health, for he has resolved upon success in life. Willpower, then, may be defined as the ability to keep a remote desire so vividly in mind that immediate desires which interfere with it are not gratified. Understand me, I pass no moral judgment on the will per se. I do not condemn it. Neither do I praise. It may be evil as well as good. A man may devote years to avenging himself upon another. He may put up with inconveniences, endure privations, submit to insults, humiliation, and risks of exposure, all of which he could avoid if he would consent to give up his aim. Napoleon consecrated his colossal will to the once glorious, and now discredited, occupation of trying to conquer the world. But will does imply thought of the future. It is ready, if need be, to sacrifice the present to the future. And that is one of the great distinguishing marks between the civilized man and the savage. The savage did not save. He did not plant crops. He did not provide for old age. He did not even set aside food for the next day. When he got a piece of meat, he gorged himself until he slept. He died young. A firmer grasp of the true idea of willpower is attainable if one is acquainted with some of the distinctions of political economy. The economist differentiates between desire and demand. When the layman talks of the demand for automobiles, he thinks usually of the desire for automobiles. The economist will not tolerate such a looseness. A beggar may genuinely desire a Rolls-Royce car, but that does not concern the manufacturer. It does not constitute part of the demand that the manufacturer must supply. He is interested only in the folk who can afford to pay for Rolls-Royce cars. And it is not only essential that the people who can afford a Rolls-Royce shall desire it, but they must desire it so much that they are willing to pay the price for it. Now we are ready to apply this economic definition to the will. After 19 pages of theory, exegesis, and preparation, we are able to lay down the first rule for the aspirant for willpower. It is a very important rule, and indeed, possibly covers most of the subject. Before you make any formal resolution whatsoever, make certain that you genuinely desire to carry it out. Let there be no doubt that the end you have in view is so desirable or advantageous that it will outweigh all desires or advantages or all other ends that are likely to have to be foregone or abandoned in order to attain it. In short, be sure you are willing to pay the price. This rule is the cornerstone. Its importance will become more and more appreciated as we go on. End of Chapter 3. Chapter 4. Old Bottles for the New Wine. Having made myself satisfactorily clear, I am now disposed to become more amiable and conciliatory. Having demolished, I hope, popular misconceptions of the will and the intellect by gunpowder charges of the truth, and having erected a new edifice in place of the old, vague, and misleading one, I am willing to add a few bricks from the old building. In short, I am prepared to make concessions. It is probably quite wise and helpful to do this because it causes less confusion and less irritation to talk, wherever possible, in terms of established conceptions than in terms of conceptions to which the reader is unaccustomed. This is all the more to be desired when the old conception has some partial justification, and when, though loosely lumping different things under one name, it nonetheless, by so doing, effects an economy of thought and of language. I have said, for instance, that there is no such thing as the will considered as an entity, that it is simply a name we give first to one desire and then to another. But by way of setting off those desires which we commonly call the will from those desires which the will opposes, I have said that the will in general represents desires for remote as opposed to immediate gratifications. Yet we may generalize still further. As long as we keep in the background of our minds that the will is really an abstraction, there is no harm in speaking of it a good part of the time as if it were an entity. And insofar as it can be said to represent a definite and permanent entity, the will may be defined as our desire to be a certain sort of character. This is still a desire, you see, and it is still an abstraction. For our desire to be a certain sort of character may mean at one moment a desire to be honest, at another moment a desire not to get drunk, and at still another moment a desire to concentrate on something. When we commonly speak of the will and think of it as if it were a definite concrete thing, it is this desire to be a certain sort of character, I think, that we commonly have in mind. When popular language says that a man is the slave of his desires, it means that he acts upon the cravings and impulses that from time to time arise, though in retrospect he will know that such actions would never be done by the kind of character he wants to be. When popular language says that a man is the master of his own desires, that he holds them in leash and under his control, it means that this desire to be a certain kind of character is at all times vivid and powerful enough to be acted upon in preference to any other fleeting or recurrent desire that may beckon him. And it is, on the whole, rather well that popular language has this conception embedded in it. For actions and decisions which would otherwise seem trivial are made by it to seem large and significant. It may not seem a matter of importance whether you take this particular drink or not, or whether you cheat the car conductor out of this particular 5-cent piece. But if you look upon the non-performance of this little act as your ability to refuse to yield to a particular impulse, and if your ability to refuse to yield to this particular impulse becomes in your mind a challenge to and a test of your entire character, you have thrown into the scale a mighty force to ensure you're taking the right action. If we accept the definition of will as the desire to be a certain kind of character, then it can be seen to be a matter of the highest importance just what kind of character you desire to be. A man may have a strong will, but low ideals, or he may have high ideals and a weak will. A man ought to make two demands of his ideals. First, that they be high enough, and second, that they be his own. If a man really and truly desires to be a roue or a pickpocket, if this be his ideal, and if his conduct conforms absolutely with his principles, there is assuredly no fault to be found with his will. He may firmly put aside all distractions and conquer every good and noble temptation in order to be a pickpocket or a roue. But society asks something more of him than strength of will. It asks that his ideas be socially beneficial, and even more may be required. It may be asked that a man put his ideals so high that it is difficult to reach them. As Browning has expressed it, a man's reach should exceed his grasp, or what's a heaven for? A man with lenient and unexacting ideals may be a tolerable character. He can never be a great one. The demand that a man's ideas should be his own is one more difficult to comply with. It means he must not accept his moral canons and standards unquestioningly from the community. It means that he must not be afraid of not doing what everybody else does, or of doing what nobody else does. It means that he must not be a mere mimic or a sheep. He must think for himself. He must examine for himself the grounds of right and wrong, and not let the principles upon which his life is conducted be laid down for him merely by other people's opinions. He must not be afraid of criticism if he feels in his own heart that he is right. This is an exacting ideal. It requires the highest moral courage. A man who lives up to this ideal may be a dangerous character. But we are not now discussing ethics per se, but only willpower. He may be a Tolstoy or a Nietzsche or a Eugene Debs, but he is a law unto himself. We may think his ethical ideas mistaken, and mistaken they may be, but we cannot but admire the strength of character which leads him to act them out in spite of social opposition. If the strength be sometimes misdirected, that is unfortunate, but the important thing, from our present standpoint, is whether it is there. This reference to the strong character recalls a pronouncement by John Stuart Mill in his essay. It is not, he says, because men's desires are strong that they act ill. It is because their consciences are weak. And this aphorism must first be analyzed in terms of our new conception of the will. A man's conscience is simply that group of desires to act socially, usefully, morally, conventionally, to secure the good opinion of his fellow men, or not to fall in his own estimation, not to offend or to give anger or sorrow to his God, or it may represent his desire to forward any other more ultimate end, to which the gratification of the immediate impulse or desire would be opposed. If the belief that Mill is contradicting with his dictum is a half-truth, so too is his own statement. It is not the conscience itself, nor the evil desires themselves, that ultimately count. It is the relation of the one to the other. The stronger his desires, the stronger his conscience, or counter-desires, must be. The weaker his desires, the less need he has for a strong conscience. But we usually, and rightly, regard the man with the stronger conscience as the stronger and more admirable character. We admire far more the man who has a violent craving for drink but nevertheless fights it down, than we do the man who refrains from drinking, but has no great liking for it anyway. Their outward action may be the same so far as its effect on themselves or society is concerned. But our untrained and unsophisticated judgments are right in attaching the importance they do to the inward struggle. For the weak man who refrains from drinking may not refrain from other actions just as personally or socially injurious that he has a greater desire for. Whereas the man with the stronger conscience, who has been able to fight this desire in this case, may be depended upon to fight lesser desires more easily. We all know the habit that many mothers have of holding up some little mollycoddle as a model to their boy. You never see Clarence do that. And we sympathize with the boy's contempt. Ah, him! He couldn't be bad. A man who is good from docility and not from stern self-control has no character. Mill recognizes this distinction, and in the passage following the sentence of his I have quoted, states powerfully the case for the man with the stronger impulses. Quote, "There is no natural connection between strong impulses and a weak conscience. The natural connection is the other way. To say that one person's desires and feelings are stronger and more various than those of another is merely to say that he has more of the raw material of human nature and is therefore capable, perhaps of more evil, but certainly of more good. Strong impulses are but another name for energy. Energy may be turned to bad uses, but more good may always be made of an energetic nature than of an indolent and impassive one. Those who have most natural feeling are always those whose cultivated feelings may be made the strongest. The same strong susceptibilities which make the personal impulses vivid and powerful are also the source from whence are generated the most passionate love of virtue and the sternest self-control." End quote. I began this chapter with one concession to the older and more habitual way of looking at things, and I shall end it with another. The first had to do with the will, and this has to do with the intellect. I have said that the intellect is a mere valet to the desires, and I have made a good many other disparaging remarks about it. But I can fancy that you were left not only unconvinced, but angry. I can fancy someone's having said while reading those remarks of mine, "My desires are determined by my intellect. A man's desires are not the desires of a rabbit. I desire to read Shakespeare and Schopenhauer. I actually prefer it to spending my evenings in a pool room or with some pretty female thing. Has not my intellect formed my desires? Has it not dictated them? What sort of flapdoodle are you trying to tell me?" Now, before such an assault I am humble, and retreat with a magnanimous gesture. It is strictly true that the desires and the intellect cannot be separated. They interact. Our desires may originally determine the direction of our intellectual interests, but once our intellectual interests have taken a certain turn, they may awaken new desires and abandon old ones. The reading of Nietzsche may change a man's ideals and aims in life. A desire for a life of study may suddenly turn into a desire for a life of action. We have defined will as the desire to become a certain sort of character. We have seen that, at critical moments, when the craving to do a certain thing threatens like a great tidal wave to sweep us helpless before it. It is this desire to become a certain sort of character which throws its weight in the scale with the other weaker desires to balance us. It is this desire which stands like a rock to cling to until the torrent has spent its force. It, too, may be swept away at times. But when it is, we know that it has not been strong enough. It is a warning that the breakwater has been too low and too weak. We must build it higher and stronger. We must strengthen this desire to become a certain sort of character. The ideal that we actually form will depend upon our parents, our religion, our associates, our reading, our thinking, the traditions of the nation, and the age in which we live. Many of these elements are intellectual, and to the extent that these determine our ideals, they determine part of our desires. But even here, we cannot say that the intellect creates our desires. Rather, it transforms them. They exist congenitally in the form of raw materials, or more strictly, they exist as a country's natural resources exist, waiting to be worked up by our environment and our intellect, itself shaped by environment, into the finished product. Practically all men are born with the sexual instinct. But though this particular instinct in its raw state may be present in equal degrees in three men, environment, training, and intellect may so shape this raw material that the first man may elect to marry and lead a normal sexual life, the second may launch forth as a roue, and the third may enter and abide by the vows of the priesthood. Similarly, the pugnacious instinct which makes dogs fight and men go to war may also, through environment and the intellect, be discharged through the channels of football or a philosophical controversy. It is the same with gregariousness or any other instinct. These are the materials, the desires, the finished products. But though the intellect can control the finished product, it cannot control the raw materials. One cannot lose an inborn instinct by thinking. One cannot create one by thinking. In this respect, the intellect bears the same relation to the instincts as man bears to matter. He can transform it, beautify it, give it value, turn it to his purposes. But he cannot create it, and he cannot destroy it. And if we are to consider this question in a truly philosophic, not to say a metaphysical manner, I may as well confess right here that in talking of desires and the intellect, I've been doing a somewhat dubious thing. But the one process is never entirely absent from the other. When I deal with this process, I deal with it rather crudely, making abstractions, treating abstractions as entities, hypothesizing them, making verbs into nouns. A man desires something, and I speak of the desires. He thinks something, and I speak of the intellect. In doing this, I am merely following common usage, and indeed the conceptions embedded in our very language practically compel me to adopt this usage if I am to prevent myself from becoming utterly obscure and transcendental. As this is supposed to be a practical manual, not a philosophic treatise, there will be no harm in continuing to talk in terms of these common conceptions. But I enter this qualification to ward off irrelevant attacks. I shall try to change the common conceptions of the nature and relations of the will and the intellect only insofar as I think it needful to change them for practical purposes. And now, having presented my apologies and concessions, we can have done with this everlasting theorizing and come to practical cases. End of chapter 4.